With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today. Simply go to tntradio.live. Deconstructing psyops, propaganda, and mainstream media garbage. Pelle NEROTH Taylor on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome to the Pelle NEROTH Taylor Show. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about, we talked a little about Russiagate in the last hour, and how actually the Russians haven't been that successful at spreading disinformation in the American election. For a start, nobody watches RT, partly because of the ban in much of the Western world, and partly because of the enormous power of American propaganda, popular culture, and so on. So it really is pot calling the kettle black. I mean, the average elite European gets his news from the New York Times and ABC, and his films from Hollywood, his cultural outlook from London and New York, mostly New York and LA, and probably spends about 5 minutes a year thinking and watching the Russian perspective on things, you know, and Russia is, after all, a very powerful neighbor. So there's no danger there. There's a guy called Larry Johnson who points out that the annual budget of American influencing operations abroad is something like $4 billion, and he breaks it down. He has official stats. Check it out on sonar21.com. He's got the list there. So the we get real, but obviously all this American refocusing on Russiagate in its persecution. I think it's a guy called Dimitri Simes, who's actually the head of the Nixon Center for 30 years. So he's a bona fide American historian, American with Russian roots. He's now been indicted. I think he's actually living in America, but he has a big house in Virginia. And the Justice Department is revving up on its anti-Russia campaign, and tirades will surely follow. We've had a couple of guests on our shows who've been researched by the FBI, but Dimitri Simes is probably the most high-profile target. And of course, the U.S. Justice Department talking about Russian influenced operations, and how this guy Dimitri Simes, I think he's more recently, but he's worked as a presenter for the Russian Channel 1, even though he's still got this property in the States, and maybe that's what they're doing him for. Anyway, it's all the same old, because Dimitri Simes was an advisor to Trump back in 2016, so maybe they'll use the sort of, the old diagrams of connection to link Putin to Dimitri Simes to Trump, and you're off to the races again. Well, all this is by way of talking about is that our next guest, Cynthia Chung, who is the wife of TNT host Matthew Ehret, who is a well-known Canadian public intellectual. She is going to tell us that relations between Russia and the US were not always so bad. In fact, I'd say probably Britain was America's chief adversary during the 19th century, and Russia, according to some historical interpretation, actually protected the North in the US Civil War from British and French interference on the side of the Confederacy. So we'll hear that out. And very interesting that the Americans in turn lent their economic model to both Russia and to Bismarck's Germany, which was called the American system, and it was an isolationist view of the world, focusing on domestic investment and building up one's own society rather than the sort of globalistic free trade, fingers in every pie approach of the then global empire Britain. And America since adopted the father's habits, as it were. And I wonder if Trump is going to impose something like the American system on his country again. The whole America First leans towards that. So Cynthia Chung is going to give us a very useful corrective of our very much sort of Churchillian narrative of the Brits and the Americans always standing side by side against those continental authoritarians. Russia and America had excellent relations in the 19th century, and we'll be discovering that. We've got Addison Smith, who's a political commentator and former host of In Focus with Addison Smith on the One American News Networks. He's the youngest ever national talk show host in the United States, and he's going to give us his perspectives on this election. Well, I just like talking about what we want in a president. There's a good article, I think, on Fox News, which let's try and get down to brass tacks. You know, what do we really need? Let's try and get away from the fluff and all the propaganda and all the political consultants and all the fluff, all the media, all the TikTok videos. Let's get serious. Well, what do you need in a president? A president must be able to identify, hire, and retain qualified senior staff to help him or her. Every president makes personnel mistakes, but they must master this skill, or at least hire people who can do so, such as chief of staffs. Secondly, a president must be able to absorb an enormous amount of incoming information, and to make sense of it, he or she must be able to prioritize the crucial data provided to them and understand the choices they confront as a result of that information. They then have to be at least an average decision maker. Again, every president makes mistakes. We cannot expect, because we will never get a perfect president, but between the choices we're given, who makes the better decisions more often than any other candidate? The president must also be able to communicate to his subordinates in the executive branch, which includes the military, what their decisions are and in what order they are to be implemented. They also need to be able to change or recall their decisions, follow up on them, and change course when the results do not match their expectations. Finally, a president must be willing and able to communicate that which needs to be communicated to a free people, free Americans via free press. He or she has to be ready, willing, and able to explain and persuade what they and the country are about. Well, so I ask you, who is going to fulfill those three criteria? Communication to your subordinates and to your country, absorbing a lot of information and make sense of it, and ability to retain staff. Well, I do ask you, is Kamala Harris the better candidate in this regard, or is it Donald Trump? Well, I mean, Kamala, it's true that Trump made a lot of bad personnel decisions after his win in 2016. He got a lot of neocons who actually went against him. And then he had a deep state or a bureaucracy that were kind of constitutionally aimed at sabotaging everything Trump was doing. But he made some bad personnel decisions, but to me, he inherited much of the bureaucracy, so he can't be blamed for that. He took them on, and they felt threatened by him in their inefficiencies and their corruption, so perhaps he couldn't be blamed for that. But I think he's got a much clearer guide now, and the fact that he's appointed Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr., who are anti-D, and J.D. Vance and Elon Musk, all these people who are people with both integrity and intelligence and experience of getting things done. Elon Musk, for instance, his transition team is a fantastic idea. And of course, everyone knows what he stands for. As for interviews and communication, well, he's on all over the media and has never knowingly rejected an interview. So I think he's a strong president. He might not always articulate in the most sophisticated of ways, but his macho talk actually gets new demographics to vote for him. But I think he's a better decision maker, I think, than Harris, who's flip-flopped over the issues and doesn't seem to be the sort of person who's interested in policy and has an independent mind. I mean, a president has to be a leader, has to take in all the evidence, and then that weight of the heavy presidential decision. She doesn't seem to be that kind of executive personality, hopey, happy, clappy stuff that you see in the TikTok videos only take you so far. And of course, she's had a 90% turnover rate in her office, or something, 94%, and they said that she's been quite bitchy towards her staff. And although Trump, there's been a host of books coming out of his White House years, saying he's a kind of lunatic. It's also true that when you go to Reddit and there are loads and loads of testimonies from people who've worked from him in golf clubs and in hotels and so on, saying what a fantastic guy he is. And maybe that's more credible than the people with an axe to grind writing White House memoirs, maybe. So it's good to focus on those things sometimes. It's interesting that so ability to communicate, ability to execute, and ability to hire the right people. Think about those when you go to the vote. It's interesting. There's a poll when you're talking about how people trust Trump and Kamala. Well, obviously, there's a very partisan vote. So most Republicans are confident in Trump in every regard, and Democrats are all pro-Harris. But where do we have the independents? Well, the independents express much more confidence on average in Trump, with 41% confident in Trump during an international crisis, compared to only 25% for Harris. And on the question of their effectiveness as commander-in-chief, 28% of independents said they had a confidence in Harris, while 44% expressed confidence in Trump. So this poll also addressed general leadership ability, asking voters whether they view Trump and Harris as strong or weak leaders. 56% said that Trump wasn't a strong leader, whereas 43% said the same of Harris. That's independents, by the way, and there's a narrow gap, and but it still shows that independents, the ones who will determine the election, regard that Trump is the better candidate. Nevertheless, of course, the Democrats are marching on with their very effective command of the mainstream media and social media, using her flimsiness as well as a positive trait, this idea that you can elect someone and that kind of feel-good nothingness that perhaps he represents will becalm America, and you can live a life next 4 years in a sort of lotus land of some kind of, racial equality promised by her skin color. And she told her fans a couple of days ago that we have dreams. We can see what is possible, unburdened what has been. Well, unburdened what it has been is of course a phrase that's been used. She's used it spontaneously, I think, in some talks, and of course, to some extent, it appeals to an America that is always reinventing itself and always has had immigration and is always looking to innovate and doesn't want to be weighed down by the past, as we Europeans are in our organically growing societies, 1,000 years old and all that, with all our old buildings and traditions. On the other hand, it's clearly a way for the kind of switch and bait tactics from her consultants, who are sort of, she, as Jake said earlier, she's basically has co-ownership of the Trump of the last 4 years. She was in the room, the last person in the room, and a lot of the bad decisions, especially over immigration and apparently Afghanistan. So she's not some kind of neophyte. She was part of this administration. So she might be unburdened in a sort of psychic sense, but she is certainly burdened by being vice president to the last administration. She's not like some new arrival. Don't kid yourselves. But of course, that's a way of turning a weakness into a strength, as it were. They're trying to make her into something she isn't. And funnily enough, they are also using her weakness into a strength, whereas Democrats depicting her strange and unattractive laughs, which often burst forth at inappropriate moments as a manifestation of the joy and a happy warrior. That's what she calls herself, a happy warrior. And they make it out to be a welcome feature, not the bug of a gauche politician. Maybe this works. House Train News Network suggests that it will, but we will see how long they can spin this out, and certainly I could all come crashing down at the debate when we'll see their intellectual chops measured up against each other for the first time directly. Anyway, we're going to go over to that to Cynthia Chung and talk about Russian-American relations after a very quick break.
Climate change policies will only widen the gap between the rich and the poor. We're today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle NEROTH show. We've got Cynthia Chung with us, who's talking about how Russians and Americans were friends in the 19th century, and the American system that developed after the victory in the Civil War was a role model for much of the rest of the world. Russia and Germany, because it forsook free trade for domestic development in a way, and for a continent-sized economy like Russia's, that was quite appealing. So, how did the Americans export the American system to Russia?
I wanted to also just clarify that for the free trade thing, that Britain wasn't, they were also using protectionism. They were enforcing free trade on other countries. So they were being hypocrites, as usual. And, during that time. And that was part of the Opium War too, right? They were arguing that it was their right to sell heroin to whoever the demand was there.
Right.
And then in the case of the United States, it's like, obviously you want free trade amongst the colonies, and you want to be able to trade properly within a country. But in order for a country to build up to a status of independence and sovereignty to be able to stand on their own 2 feet, you have to have a certain amount of protectionism. But free trade isn't bad in the sense that you don't have, if you're genuine and you're honest in your actions, but that's not the world that we work in, right? There is a form of economic warfare. So you do need a certain amount of protectionism. In terms of the assassination of Lincoln, I'm just going to bring up, again, Matt is the one who is more of the expert in this, and he wrote a paper called The Trifold Nature of the Deep State. There was a $550 check that Booth was given that was signed by the Ontario Bank president, Henry Starnes, in October 1864. So there is a direct connection with Montreal British intelligence, because Canada was the hub for British intelligence, and even the Kennedy assassination with Permindex, Montreal is involved as a location for that, where I live. Wow. But yeah, people can refer to Matt's article for more details on that. In terms of the American system, I mean, I don't know how much time we're going to have, but the rail that was established in Russia, the rail system also that Sun Yat-sen wanted to do for China, he was the first president of China. This was all modeled off of what Lincoln had done, the amazing accomplishment of the transcontinental rail during a civil war, which is through a credit system. So a lot of these countries realized, Friedrich List too, for the German economy, this was also modeled off of the American economy. It was based off of a development of industry through credit. And that was revolutionary because it was freeing countries from the control over empire.
Well, it's interesting because what you had, if you were sitting in 1860s Britain, you can see that your small island has these far-flung colonies, but they're not going to win the long-term race. You've got China on the one hand, which, as you said, has been a victim of the British Opium Wars. You've got America, which has just defeated the South. And then you've got Russia, which is a coming giant. And then you've even got Germany, which has just united, it said, in 1870s. And all these countries were large and they were continent-based. Even Germany wasn't as large as the others. And Britain was a tiny island. It's amazing when you think about it, the British achievement is a small island off the coast of Europe, which has dominated the world for 500 years. But the point is, they didn't dominate it by being nice guys drinking tea, right? So let's just get the facts right, or always fighting the bad guys. They've done it by being the bad guys themselves sometimes. That's the way history works. There are no good guys and maybe no bad guys. And they use that through very effective use of propaganda, of spy operations, through commercial warfare, on the whole bag of tricks, not because they and naval blockades and so on, because they never had a large army, using other countries as allies, with countries with large land armies. And I think it's going on in Ukraine, is what's old now. But so the Americans sold their model to Russia and to even to Bismarck's Germany as well, apparently. Was this then a big contributor to these countries' huge rise in the 1890s?
I would say most definitely, and I wanted to just add that for the Britain point, not to bash Britain too much, but because Britain was a sovereign nation state at first, and there's always been this component to Britain that has tried to continue that true tradition and fought against the identity of empire that later on took over Britain. But, Matt has also wrote about this extensively. This was something that basically, systems of empire from the past, countries that become empires today are, have always been infected by this, line that has continued on. So there is a lot of Roman carryover that, when was also in Venice, was also in Amsterdam, that eventually went into Britain, and Britain kind of got brought into that sort of network. And that's why a small little island was able to do that, because it was a network that already existed. Venice too is a small little, swamp area off of Italy that was also incredibly powerful. In terms of the Bismarck situation, he wanted to build the Baghdad rail, and this was a huge thing. That's why, Germany, I think, was kind of set up in World War One. This is why people have not been told like the real reason why World War One started, which was to break up this process that was occurring where a lot of countries were now starting to become industrialized, and they wanted to trade and they wanted peace. Like, people naturally want to just have prosperity. Nobody wants to have permanent war. And Germany had already had the Protestant Catholic wars and things like this. They clearly, wanted to prosper. And the Baghdad rail, if it had been successful and built during Bismarck's time, it would have avoided, I think, the Sykes-Picot carving up of the Middle East, which is what led to the creation of the British mandate over Palestine. And then Britain would eventually establish Israel, in that whole affair. And it caused a lot of problems in the Middle East.
I mean, the other theme, well, we have to sort of wind up here, is when England was relatively harmless, but the British Empire also destroyed the Brits in a way. And you could say that America's at a crossroads at the moment, and Trump represents a more nationalistic approach, and the Democrats are basically still affiliated with a mother country, or you could call it a globalist empire, a global empire now, which is not situated just in London, certainly not in London, but Washington, New York, London, maybe Singapore or something, or Geneva. And a lot of people are not happy about it, whether they're living in Germany or whether they're living in America or in Sweden. I mean, these are the big forces, nationalists versus globalists. So the point is, we've seen it before. And but you just to pivot very quickly, are you having a conference in Toronto coming up soon, and then in Calgary? You could perhaps just say something about that.
Yeah, sure. We're going to have a conference in Calgary and Toronto coming up in this September. I'm just looking up the dates because I'm really bad with that. Yeah. On the 22nd in Calgary and the 29th in Toronto. And I have it up on my Substack, Through Glass Darkly by Cynthia Chung. For anyone who wants to purchase tickets, they can. Yeah.
And the topics are, well, I guess this is on a tangent because it's maybe not necessarily about the British Empire, but many other topics that you cover, because the Rising Tide Foundation is basically dedicated to bringing people together and creating better understanding between East and West. So,
dialogue of cultures and a knowledge of history. But the events are called Freedom is not about parties, but about universal principles, because I think that we have to just get back to the ABCs, and that parties, I think, on both sides have kind of lost their way in terms of the rah-rahing, and we have to just focus on what does a country need to build itself back to have a bright future.
Well, certainly Canada's come under a lot of criticism for censorship laws and, political correctness gone mad. And perhaps we can talk about that another time. Well, Cynthia, thank you so much. Great to have you on. Cynthia Chung, check her out on her Substack and the Rising Tide Foundation on Google. Thank you so much, Cynthia. And we're going to go on to our next guest after a very quick break. This is the Pelle NEROTH Taylor Show on TNT News Talk.
Exposing the deep state and government overreach. You're with Pelle NEROTH Taylor on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, we can't get enough of the US election, can we? It's so interesting that we're going to have a second helping of it on our show today. And we've got Addison Smith with us, who's a political commentator and former host of In Focus with Addison Smith on the One America News Network. He's the youngest ever national talk show host in America. Welcome to the show, Addison.
Thank you for having me, Pelle. It's great to be here.
It's interesting. One America is one of those sort of networks that's devoted to the truth, and so is TNT. But of course, Kamala Harris has promised to save democracy by censoring free speech, and she made that talk in 2019 when she's promised to direct the DOJ to censor misinformation and hate online. And there's a lot of talk about whether if the Democrats get in, they'll take the sledgehammer to X, which of course is run by Trump. What are your thoughts on the whole censorship issue?
Well, I mean, it is somewhat comforting to see that the party of the people, who threw out the people's candidate that they elected and then installed someone that not a single person voted for, is now going to continue saving the people and being their voice by telling the people to shut up. So yeah, this was Kamala Harris, the DOJ, saying that she's going to direct them to censor misinformation online. But what she really means, and what Democrats only mean when they use the term misinformation, is just whatever they deem to be misinformation. Misinformation does have an actual definition: false information, inaccurate information. But for Democrats, it is an entirely different term. It is whatever we don't like or whatever we believe to be wrong or inconvenient or make us look bad. We're going to censor that. And we saw the Ministry of Truth a few years ago that was almost launched under the Biden administration. They had to shut it down after receiving so much pressure and backlash, universal pressure and backlash from all sides, that, hey, maybe this isn't a good idea to give the rich and powerful among us the definition to define what we are and aren't allowed to say. We kind of have this thing in America called the First Amendment, where we are allowed to say what we want and what we believe, and whether or not you like it or whether or not you think is true is actually your opinion. So there's a far gap to bridge there between misinformation, so-called, and really just people exercising their First Amendment right and having their opinion on things.
What's the difference between misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation? Do you know?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a one-size-fits-all for them. They use the terms interchangeably. Misinformation, disinformation, it doesn't matter. In the end, it just comes all out to things that I don't like that you're saying. Like during COVID, for example, when it was misinformation and disinformation to say that the virus came from the Wuhan lab. We now know that to be true. It was misinformation to say that masks maybe weren't that effective. Well, it turns out they are that effective in spreading the virus. Or the vaccine. Hey, maybe we shouldn't take this thing. Vaccines take years and years to develop. This was developed in about 5 minutes. Maybe we should have a little more experimentation done on this before we inoculate the masses. Turns out that was true, and we're still living with the consequences of that mass inoculation to this day. The 6 feet social distancing, they've now admitted that was totally arbitrary. They just sort of picked a number and went with it. But at the time, that was the science with a trademark, with a copyright over at Pelle. And if you go against the trademark, you're in a lot of trouble.
Well, I mean, it's a bit rich. I've been quoting throughout the day the editor of the British newspaper, The Guardian, which has a very high riding a very high political horse. They point out autocrats in other countries, but and they even have on the bottom of every article, we don't have rich oligarchs supporting us. It's all BS because it's the most dishonest newspaper out there. But the editor has gone on to a new magazine called Prospect, where he makes a case that the information gathering process that involves Musk and his idea of the citizen journalism and everybody having a voice completely goes against centuries of truth telling, kind of pioneered by the British, back in the 1700s, and the triangle of lawmakers, parliamentarians, barristers, lawyers, and journalists. Oh, they're all so fine and dandy, and everything works well. Well, I don't think that's how information has worked at all. Information usually works, or the truth usually works by a dissident pushing for it, and people first they laugh at you, and then they hate you, and then you win. That's how truth finding goes. The Galileo model, as it were. It's not at all a consensual process by establishments everywhere. So I think that what Elon Musk is doing is he's letting all these thousands of hypothesis makers, just as like thousands of home experimenters, people working out. And that's what the American model has been, that that's why you're so innovative, because although you come out with a lot of conspiracy theories, inside those conspiracy theories, there's a lot of truths as well. And so for The Guardian to be talking about, the truth process emerging through establishments talking and meeting up together, well, it certainly didn't reveal the COVID story, did it? So, the alternative media should be praised for that alone. And I think they're talking about the Trump assassination attempt in a very mature and intellectual way, whereas the mainstream media have just moved on from that, and they're talking about something else. Kamala Harris's suitability for the presidency. So I don't know. It all seems incredibly, the mainstream media seem to be terribly dishonest. Don't you find the same?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think dishonest is an understatement. One of the truest things that Donald Trump has said in his lifetime, certainly throughout his presidency, and the mainstream media, of course, and the entire establishment, when Donald Trump said that the press is the enemy of the people, and everyone lost their minds. Oh, he's demonizing the press. This sets such a dangerous precedent. Well, you have to ask yourself, why is he saying that? Because that does resonate. That's something I believe to be true, that the mainstream press is the enemy of the people. Why does it resonate? Well, because we've caught them time and again for years and years and years lying to our faces, and provably so. Again, we just went through the entire coronavirus shtick when you had MSNBC and CNN, ABC, NBC peddling this propaganda because it came from the highest of high priests, Dr. Fauci. Everything he said was taken as gospel truth, and that's how it was reported to the press. And you mentioned the Trump assassination attempt. You even had people questioning, including in the DOJ, whether Trump was actually shot, just to see it be totally memory hold in a matter of days after it unfolded. It is why the people see the mainstream media as the enemy of the people. They can't trust them. And perhaps the biggest evidence of this is networks like TNT and alternative media networks who've seen such a rise and grown such a large audience in such a small amount of time. It's because people are tired of being lied to. People are tired of turning on the news and seeing the same establishment talking points. So they're turning to people like TNT, like InfoWars, like Daily Wire and The Blaze and so on, because they feel like they have nowhere else to go to get the truth. They're certainly not going to get it from the airport outlet shills like CNN.
And X is apparently the most downloaded app in the world or something. And of course, that's serving as a news source. I mean, as I understand it, the under 30s or maybe under 35s have abandoned newspapers, and the New York Times and so on. And of course, they must be absolutely panicking at this thought. And their only solution is to kill the competition rather than and deal with it, rather than serve up things that they and demonize them and slander them. But the whole Russiagate thing, of course, was something that the Guardian was very big on, making it out that Trump was a Russian agent. Well, I mean, that was disproved by the Miller investigation back in 2019, and he was handpicked by the Democrats. Of course, in 2015 there was a Democratic operative called Brent something Rudkowski, I can't remember. In the Podesta emails, he was saying we're gonna yoke Trump together with Putin and slaughter him that way, and that's what happened, of course. But he wasn't a Russian spy. But do you think that the Democrats are going to use that playbook again to try and link Trump with Putin? And could say that in context of the Putin's tongue-in-cheek endorsement of Kamala Harris?
Well, I think they're already trying to draw that link again. There's been this story the last couple of days. I haven't followed it too closely, but Tenet Media, which was this new alternative outlet that grew quite rapidly and joined up with a lot of mainstream Trump supporters, offered them contracts to these journalists. We now found out that was a actual Russian scheme, and now we're seeing how the people involved had no clue that it was a Russian scheme. These people like Benny Johnson and Tim Pool, they were essentially victims of a lying scheme, and now we're already seeing how that's being thrown at them, saying, "Oh, look, these Russian propagandists, these Putin stooges, were working with Russia, we're being paid by Russia to promote pro-Russian propaganda." When in reality, and as even the DOJ admits in the indictment, no, that it was actually a secretive scheme the whole time. But now, of course, you're seeing the libs on X saying things like, I am not going to vote for the guy who's working hand in hand with Russia, the guy that Russia wants to win. Well, then you turn around and 2 seconds later, Putin comes out and endorses Kamala Harris. And every outlet, I'll say this too, every outlet, CNN, MSNBC, put in their headlines, Putin jokingly or laughingly endorses Kamala Harris. That's called editorializing. When you do that, you're not delivering news. You're editorializing when you're trying to give Kamala Harris a free pass out of this and suggest that, oh, Putin's endorsement of Harris was a joke, when in reality it is a joke, but it's not at the same time, because of course Putin would prefer Harris to win. And by the way, he said the same thing about Joe Biden before he got couped. Harris is a weak leader. She was put in charge of the border. She failed. She was brags about being one of the leaders in the Afghanistan withdrawal, which got us 13 dead Americans and billions of dollars of military equipment donated to the Taliban. She doesn't stand a snowball's chance in hell against Vladimir Putin or any foreign leader for that matter. This is the same woman who can't even talk herself out of drinking half a bottle of vodka before a campaign rally. So I doubt she can talk Putin out of doing things like invading Ukraine.
Yeah, that point about her alcoholism, that's cropped up from time to time. I mean, I think there was a campaign tweet by the Trump's campaign director, but I haven't seen anyone else talk about it that much. Is there a kind of gentleman's agreement? I mean, maybe there's a feeling that if you're having a go at a woman, that's not quite what gentlemen do, and it'll rebound against the right. Or do you think they're holding it for later, or what?
I think any criticism of Kamala Harris is fair game. And even if she doesn't show up to all of her rallies completely wasted, she certainly does talk like she is, slurring all of her words together. And of course, her infamous ugly laugh, her cackle. She doesn't conduct herself in a way that anyone would find to be sober and responsible. And so I think it's fair game.
But I mean, is that slurring just the odd occasion? I mean, a lot of people drink too much, especially in a high stress situation like in politics. So when you see this video after video put out by the right, you don't know how representative that is. I don't know, from your perch where you are, have you heard anything more about her drinking problems, or is it just the sort of drinking issues that a lot of people have, they drink too much on stressful occasions?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that are certain in life. If you live in D.C., it's death, taxes, and becoming an alcoholic at some point. It especially runs in the family in the Biden administration. Kamala Harris slurring her words, Joe Biden not being able to string two sentences together. We know that's obviously not because of his alcohol, but the fact that he was alive at the time of Pharaoh. But it does seem to be a very unfortunate pattern. I mean, we joke about it. We make jokes about Kamala Harris being an alcoholic, but how, to the extent that it might be true, it is sad to see. It's also dangerous because we're putting a woman in who's going to be in charge of the nuclear codes, potentially in office for 4 years, and you combine that with very ambitious world leaders who very much want to see the fall of America, and you put someone in who is not stable, and we've already done that with Joe Biden, and we see where that's gotten us.
Well, I mean, do you think that if Kamala were elected, who would really be running the show? Is it Obama?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Kamala Harris was actually one of the true things she said is how pivotal of a role she has played in the Biden administration with things like the Afghanistan withdrawal. I absolutely believe she's played a pivotal role, and I believe that's in part why everything has been so disastrous, from the economy, from negotiations with world leaders, from immigration. I mean, that's the biggest thing. Kamala Harris was the border czar. Joe Biden said when Kamala Harris speaks on matters of immigration, she's speaking for me. And that has gotten us the tune of 10 million illegal aliens, countless people who have been raped and murdered, like Laken Riley. It's everything Kamala Harris touches seems to fall apart. And so I absolutely believe that
so you think she's been a decision maker, and she will be a decision maker, although a hesitant one. You don't think she'll be run by someone else, by the deep state, by the bureaucrats, by Obama, by Hillary Clinton? You think she'll be a decision maker, but an ineffective one?
Yes, but I also do think that the deep state is going to have their way with her, just like people like Putin would have their way with her. Again, can you imagine Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un at the negotiation table with cackling Kamala Harris? Just the sheer optics of that alone would be an embarrassment to the world, much less having Vladimir Putin actually pressing Kamala Harris, the woman who described the Ukraine war is Ukraine is a country in Europe. Russia is also a country in Europe. Russia went into Ukraine, and that was very bad to do. I mean, this is how she talks. She talks like she's talking to kindergartners. That's not going to fly.
And she's never been to Europe, and she doesn't care. I mean, she hasn't traveled very much. She's fantastic.
And she couldn't point to. And she couldn't point to Ukraine on a map. There was a moment in the Republican debates during the primaries where this is true of both sides who are peddling funding for Ukraine, for the Ukraine war. When Vivek Ramaswamy told Nikki Haley to name 3 cities in Ukraine, this country she wants to send billions of dollars to, and she just stood there completely silent because, of course, she couldn't. And I think it's going to be the same thing with Kamala Harris.
Well, although still 50% of the population or more or less is going to vote for her, but we'll see if they get any see the truth, and they'll do this by watching yourself, my good sir, and watching this show. This is the Pelle and NEROTH Daily Show on TNT News Talk. Thank you so much, Addison Smith, political commentator and former host of In Focus with Addison Smith on the One America News Network, youngest ever national talk show host in America. Thank you so much, sir. Love to have you on again. This is the Pelle and NEROTH Daily Show. We'll be back on Monday.